Hello and welcome to Gaming History 101. My name is Sasha and I'll be your host today. If you know anything about the history of technology that spans earlier than the year 2000, you'll probably hear about a little company called Commodore. Commodore was one of the most successful computer and technology companies in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. They were especially huge in the departments of personal computers, hardware development, and calculators. But more of those first two. They made some of the most popular and groundbreaking hardware, from the Commodore C110 calculator all the way up to the Commodore PET and beyond. While they're mostly known for the computer line named after the company, Commodore 64, Commodore PET, Commodore 16, you know. Did you know that Commodore actually had a few shots in the gaming market as well, like dedicated game consoles? Well, that's what we're here to talk about. We're going to talk about several Commodore consoles, actually all the Commodore consoles that attempted to enter the gaming market, and what happened to them as they try to compete with the others. Strap on your seatbelts and let's learn about the history of these machines. First, we'll be talking about the Commodore Max machine. There's really not all that much information or much to say at all about this one, so let's just blow by this part of the video really quick. The Max machine was released in 1982 in between the releases of the Commodore VIC-20 and the Commodore 64 personal computers. It was released in Japan as the Max machine, capital M-A-X, the United States as Ultimax, and in Germany as the VC-10. While internationally it was released under a bunch of different names, the official manual for the Commodore 64 mentions the Max machine, which may show that there originally were intended plans to release it under the official name of Max. Nobody knows for sure whether it was or wasn't released under its official name internationally though, like for sure, since this computer is ridiculously rare. Or not ridiculously rare, but semi-rare. They're pretty hard to find. This computer used cartridges as its software medium, and much like the Atari Lynx, wouldn't boot up if a cartridge wasn't inserted into it. The system had a membrane keyboard and 2K of RAM, as well as 0.5K of color RAM. It had a VIC-2 6566 graphics chip, which displayed at a resolution of 320 by 200 with a color palette of 16 colors. It used the same chipset and 6510 CPU and SID sound chip as the regular Commodore 64. It also had the same ROM cartridge architecture, which meant that games released on the Max machine would, in theory, work on the Commodore 64. It was possible to use a tape drive for storage, but it lacked the ports for printers and hard disks and floppy drives and everything else, which made it fairly bare bones for a computer, especially during that time period. It was meant to sell for around $200, but although the Max machine had better graphics and sound, the VIC-20, which, keep in mind the Max was supposed to be a successor to, sold for around the same amount of money and had more games, more capabilities, and more upgradability, and like actual usability, and all of that made it that much more attractive to the consumers. Next is the Commodore 64 GS, or the Commodore 64 game system. The 64 GS was released in Europe in 1990 as a game console based off the Commodore 64 architecture. The main difference that differentiates the Max machine from the 64 game system is that the 64 GS is internally very similar to the Complete 64, meaning you can play games meant for the Commodore 64 on the 64 game system. Support from developers was very limited, as many were unconvinced that the console would be a success in the console market. Ocean Software was the most supportive, offering a wide range of titles. Some of these were cartridge-only games, offering features that would have been impossible on titles that were sold on cassettes. Others were straight ports of games originally developed for the 64. Domark and System 3 also released a number of titles for the system, and conversions of some old Codemasters and Microprose games also made their way to the system. Denton Designs released some games, among them Bounces, which was released in 1985. The software bundled with the Commodore 64 game system came on a multi-cart containing 4 games: Fiendish Freddy's Big Top of Fun, International Soccer, Flimbo's Quest, and Clax. These games, with the exception of International Soccer, were previously ordinary tape-based games, but their structure and methods of control, ones where no keyboard was necessary, made them well suited on the new system. International Soccer was previously released in 1983 on cartridge for the original Commodore 64. Ocean produced a number of games for the Commodore 64 game system, among them a remake of Double Dragon, which contained more similarities to the NES version of the game than the original Commodore 64 cassette version, Navy SEALs, RoboCop 2 and 3, Chase HQ 2 Special Criminal Investigation, Pang, Battle Command, Toki, Shadow of the Beast, and Lemmings were other games developed by Ocean for the C64 GS. They also produced Batman the movie for the console, but this was a direct conversion of the cassette game, evidenced by the screens prompting the player to press play that briefly appeared in between levels. Here's a little fun fact. Some of the earliest Ocean cartridges had a manufacturing flaw, where the connector was placed too far back in the cartridge case. The end result was that the cartridge could not be used with the standard C64 computer. Members of Ocean's staff had to manually drill holes in the side of the cartridges to make them fit. System 3 released Last Ninja Remix and Myth History in the Making, although both were also available on cassette. Domark also offered 2 titles, Badlands and Cyberball, which were available only on cartridges. The C64 GS was plagued with problems all the way from the start. Remember how I said that original Commodore 64 games would work on the C64 GS? Well, that was just in theory. Despite the amount of software that was already released for the Commodore 64, due to the lack of a keyboard or really any serious ports on the C64 GS, it really made a lot of those games impossible to play just because the hardware physically wasn't there to control it with. This often meant that people bought secondhand Commodore 64 software only to find out that it wasn't compatible. To kind of combat the lack of a keyboard, the basic control system for the C64 GS was a joystick made by Cheetah. This was called the Annihilator. This joystick, while using the standard Atari 9-pin plug, I think it's called the DB9 connector officially, offers 2 independent buttons. The second button would be located on the base of the joystick. This 9-pin plug was standard on many of the systems of the era, and it would make its appearance on the Sega Master System, Atari 2600, Sega Genesis, and many of the other second or third generation consoles of that era. Unfortunately, the Cheetah Annihilator was very expensive and it was manufactured in very small quantities, making replacements hard to come by. Prior to the console's release, Commodore wanted to generate a whole lot of market hype for a system that was releasing in an already crowded market. Zap64 and Your Commodore 64 magazines of that era, reported that Commodore originally promised over 100 titles for the system just by December, even though December was like 2 months from that writing. In reality, however, only 28 games were ever officially released for the Commodore 64 game system. And even out of those 28, only 9 of those were exclusives. The rest of those were just ports of older games released on cassette tapes. While most of the titles that Ocean promised to release on the Commodore 64 game system did appear, with the notable exception of Operation Thunderbolt, a number of promises from a bunch of other publishers failed to materialize and be fulfilled. Similar problems plagued the Amstrad GX 4000 when it released that same year, but that's a story for another time. Now, for this next system, we're going to talk about the CD-TV, which is an acronym of Commodore Dynamic Total Vision, which itself is a backronym of Compact Disc Total Vision. What in the hell? The CD-TV was released in March 1991 for $999, or just about the equivalent of $1,795 as of August of 2017. This wasn't necessarily a game system as much as it was an all-in-one entertainment system, putting it more in competition with the Philips CDI than the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, and whatever else it was trying to compete against. Ironically, or not, a market for neither of these appliances ever materialized, and as such, both of the products flopped. The CD-TV was originally announced at the 1990 Chicago CES event, with promises of over 100 titles on store shelves by the end of that year. The product debuted in America for $999 in March 1991, as I said in the beginning of the segment. In the UK, it came out for £499. I'm not sure if that's equivalent in the slightest. The package came with the unit, 2 games, and a remote control. By 1990, Commodore had a poor reputation among consumers and developers. Computer Gaming World wrote that year of its abysmal record of consumer and technical support in the past. Since the CD-TV was essentially an Amiga computer in the shell of a Laserdisc player, the company chose Amiga enthusiast magazines as its chief advertising channel. But the Amiga community as a whole avoided the CD-TV outright, expecting an add-on CD-ROM drive for the Amiga computer, which eventually came in the form of the Amiga A570 drive. This further hurt sales of the CD-TV, as both it and an A570 equipped Amiga 500 were the exact same thing electronically and could both run CD-TV software, so there really was no point in making the purchase of the CD-TV. However, Nolan Bushnell, one of the chief endorsers of the CD-TV, who was also the CEO of Atari, argued that the system's high price point alone was enough to explain its market failure. It's very difficult to sell significant numbers of anything that costs more than $500. I felt that I could sell 100,000 of something that costs $800 standing on my head, and I can tell you that the number of units that we had sold in the US at $800, you could put in your eye and not draw tears. Under the hood, the CD-TV was running a Motorola 68000 CPU running at either 7.16 MHz in the NTSC regions or 7.09 MHz in PAL regions, as well as 1 megabyte of Amiga chip RAM, which was upgradable to 9 megabits total with the use of an external card that added 8 megabits of fast memory to your system. It also had 512K of various ROMs and a chipset that supported a 12-bit color palette of up to 4096 colors, with up to 32, 64, or all 4096 of those colors on screen at once. The CD-TV was able to display at resolutions of either 320 by 400i or 640 by 400i for NTSC regions, or 320 by 512 or 640 by 512 for PAL regions. In addition, it was possible to hook up a keyboard, a mouse, as well as other ports for different accessories such as a serial port, a parallel port, MIDI in and out, and even a port to connect a floppy drive. Though Commodore later developed an improved and cost-reduced CD-TV2, it was never released. Some prototype boards were developed and leaked and now circulate around the web as far as I can tell. I'm not going to read off the specs, but I'll put them on the screen right here. Commodore discontinued the CD-TV just 2 years after launch, with the launch of the Amiga CD32, which again was substantially based on Amiga hardware, in this case the newer Amiga 1200, but explicitly targeted the games market. So why exactly did the CD-TV fail? Well, it's a simple answer really. The Amiga 500 and the CD-TV were literally the same thing. It's bad enough that the Amiga 500 could run games and software released for the CD-TV, but if you could get literally the same exact performance, if not better, out of an Amiga computer, why would you bother getting the more expensive set-top box? It doesn't really make any sense. The last system that we're going to talk about today is the Commodore Amiga CD32. I'm sure this is the one all of you have been waiting for, so I'm glad that you guys were excited. If you were. If you weren't, then disregard that. The Amiga CD32, I'll just call it the CD32 from now on, codenamed Spellbound, is the first 32-bit console released in Europe, Australia, Canada, and Brazil. It was first announced at the London Science Museum on July 16, 1993, and released in September of that same year. It was based on Commodore's advanced graphical architecture chipset, and it was very much similar to the Amiga 1200 computer. Using third-party expansions, it's possible to give it more RAM, a keyboard, a mouse, a hard drive, and even a floppy drive, and I'm pretty sure even a CD drive. Well, that's kind of redundant, it already has a CD drive, but you could essentially, with the third-party add-ons, turn the CD32 into a full-fledged Amiga 1200. In addition to that, a hardware MPEG-1 decoding module also came out, which let you decode MPEG-1 video for things like video CDs. In the Christmas period following its launch, the Amiga CD32 accounted for 38% of all CD drive sales in the UK, surpassing that even of the Sega Mega CD. However, it was soon overshadowed by other consoles that were based off CDs from other companies, and it soon went into bankruptcy, and it discontinued the CD32, understandably. Commodore first demonstrated the CD32 at the World of Commodore show in September 1993. It promised to sell the console in some cities by Christmas, with wider distribution around January 1994. It would originally sell for $399, or just about $660 as of 2016. The CD32 was released in Canada, and it was scheduled for a US release around late February to early March 1994. It would be priced at $399 with 2 pack-in games. The pack-in games would be Pinball Fantasies and Sleepwalker, with 6 other separate games released at launch. However, a deadline was reached by Commodore to pay $10 million in royalties to CAD-Track on US patent 4,197,950. This has to do with their XOR patent, XOR, which basically has to do with the way a computer mouse works. I'm not going to get into that, it's way too complicated even for me. However, if you're really interested, I'll link to the patent down in the description below. A federal judge impacted Commodore by injunctioning them and barred them from selling their product in the United States until this debt was settled. This halted the official selling of the CD32 in the United States. Commodore had built up inventory of the CD32 in their Philippines manufacturing facility, but since they couldn't bring it to the United States, they just kind of sat there and rotted until they paid off the debt, which I don't think they ever did. Commodore declared bankruptcy shortly after, and the CD32 was promptly discontinued. The CD32, while never officially coming to the United States, did see some imported Canadian models make their way to the United States, mostly through mail-order catalogs, although I am pretty sure some of them came from stores, but I'm not sure which ones. On release, the CD32 was marketed by Commodore as the world's first 32-bit CD games console. Although it was indeed the first such machine released in Europe and North America, it was beaten to market by the FM Towns Marty, a console released exclusively in Japan, who had several months on the CD32. However, the CD32's 68EC020 CPU has a 32-bit data bus both internally and externally, while the 386SX in the FM Towns Marty has a 16-bit data bus externally. At the end of the day, Commodore was unable to meet demand for new units because of the component supply problems. Sales of the CD32 in Europe were not enough to save Commodore, and the bankruptcy of Commodore International in April 1994 caused the CD32 to be discontinued only months after its debut. During the brief Amiga CD32 presence in the market, approximately 100,000 units of it were sold in Europe alone. Let's take a look at what the CD32 was rocking under the hood. The CPU of choice here, as mentioned just a few seconds ago, was a Motorola 68000, specifically a Motorola 68EC020 running at 14.32 MHz in NTSC regions or at 14.18 MHz in PAL regions. It came with 2 MB of Amiga chip RAM, 1 MB of Kickstart ROM with the CD32 firmware, 1 KB of EEPROM, the Akiko chip, which I'll talk about in a second, and a 24-bit color palette, which could display up to 16.8 million colors, with between 144 and 256 of those on screen at a time. It displayed these colors at a resolution of either 320 by 200 to 1280 by 400i in NTSC regions, or either 320 by 256 to 1280 by 512i in PAL regions. It came running Amiga OS 3.1. Now, one of the main problems with the CD-TV, as I mentioned earlier, was the ability to play CD-TV games on a regular Amiga 500, which basically nullified any point of buying the CD-TV. To remedy this, Commodore introduced the Akiko chip. In addition to being the CD-ROM controller and a GPU assistant, it was also a lockout chip, in a sense. This prevented CD32 games from being played on anything but a CD32. The CD32 could also be expanded to run like a normal Amiga 1200 computer. Some would even say that purchasing a fully upgraded and expanded CD32 is the de facto Amiga 1200 experience. Purchasing various expansion modules expanded the capability of the CD32 and allowed extra hardware to be plugged in, such as a 3.5-inch floppy drive, a hard drive, and an IBM PC keyboard. An official CD32 branded keyboard was released though, which used the aux port on the left side of the machine. One of the expansion modules, the Paravision SX1, seemed to have been designed around Commodore's original mechanical specification for the console, and not the actual units provided, which caused it not to fit very well, and even required a modification to equip correctly. On top of that, if you're not careful, you can disconnect it during use and that'll just screw everything up. The upgraded version of this pack, the SX32, fixed these problems and now included an additional 68030 processor clocking in at 25 MHz. Now, as I just said, the reason Commodore included the Akiko chip in the CD32 was to keep the software released for the CD32 from being played on a regular Amiga 1200 computer. However, I guess in a last-ditch effort to save the community, Commodore designed an external CD-ROM drive for the 1200 that had the Akiko chip built in, thus turning any old Amiga 1200 into one compatible with CD32 software. You may think that's the end to all developments with the CD32, but the CD32 and its architecture were actually around in use for various applications up until even the early 2000s. In 1993, 109 CD32 units were installed to run the interactive exhibits at the London Transport Museum, Covent Garden. They provided information, animations, pictures, sound, and text available in several languages, as well as a London Underground simulator. The systems were produced by the Oldham, Hampshire-based company Index Information, utilizing their CD32 interface units. In 1995, an Italian company named CD Express used the CD32 as a basis for an arcade machine called Kubo CD32. Inside these machines, stock CD32s were hooked up to an external circuit board, which basically acted as a converter to route all the input and output into a standard JAMA connector for use in an arcade cabinet. The software was provided on CD-ROM. 9 games are known to exist, all of which are original games created by CD Express. In the mid to late 90s, some vehicle registries in Canada utilized CD32 systems for interactive multimedia testing for driver's license applications. In 1995, Taurus Ventures Incorporated in Burnaby, British Columbia, developed the Van City Direct TV system based on the CD32 for the Van City Credit Union. It features a custom modem also designed by TVI. From 1994 to 1997, Sylvan Learning Systems used CD32 systems in their Wall Street Institute learning centers. Main features include software with voice tone recognition and interactive activities very focused on listening. These consoles have a floppy disk drive unit attached, with a clock unit for saving students' progress and sharing them with teachers. Data was stored in a central database, and the system offered an advanced multimedia environment with statistics. It was replaced with various PC systems after some years of intensive use and a very strong stock of spare consoles and pieces. And finally, in the late 1990s to early 2000s, slot machine manufacturer Star Games utilized a stripped-down CD32 motherboard in many of their slot machines. Machines confirmed to be operating on CD32 hardware are Hawaiian Delight, Leprechaun Luck, and Mr. Magic. In conclusion, the Commodore brand had a lot of interesting business ventures, but due to poor business decisions, none of these ventures really went all that far. Although, I'm mostly talking about the unsuccessful ones more than the successful ones. Today, there are a lot of people making interesting things for the Commodores, mostly for the Amiga, but all of the Commodore systems. 8-Bit Guy and Modern Vintage Gamer both make really interesting videos about different Commodore products. I know Modern Vintage Gamer and his channel is mostly geared towards Amiga stuff, but he does branch off into Commodore 64 and other Commodore stuff every once in a while. Amiga OS, while maintained and developed further by Hyperion Entertainment, requires a PowerPC processor to run anything above 4.0, while any version 3.9 and below requires a Motorola 68K processor. So if you have a Power Mac G4 or a Mac Mini G4, Power Mac G5, this thing is like 50 pounds and it's solid aluminum. You have an alternative to macOS 10.5.8 or whatever distribution of Linux you're running on it. The Commodore 64 lives on today in many forms. A lot of people are making custom expansions for it, like Ethernet cards and different sound cards and SD card adapters and what have you. Several Commodore 64 games were released on the Wii Virtual Console a little bit ago, but in 2013 they were removed from the Wii Virtual Console for unknown reasons. If you like this video, be sure to click up here in the cards to see the last 2 videos uploaded on this channel, as well as my social media handles, which will be somewhere here. If you like this video, don't forget to click that like button, but if you didn't, that other button seems to work pretty okay too. Don't forget to click that subscribe button and that bell notification to see anything that I upload, as you'll be immediately notified. And if you know anybody who likes calculators, Commodores, or Amigas, be sure to share this video with your friends and family and whoever likes Amigas, both kinds of Amigas. And who knows, I might get some more fans, you might get some more content, and it's a win-win situation for the both of us. But if this is where we part for today, this has been Gaming History 101. Thank you so much for watching. Peace.